Okay, so we're back to talk about the media. So media are technologically developed forms of human communication that mediate reality for us. And I think the second part of that is really important, the concept of mediating reality. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on quite a bit for the rest of this lecture, how the media can kind of structure and determine what we do and don't see, how it can suggest certain ideas to us. It's obviously not as simple as saying, the media kind of controls exactly what we think. So, for instance, a piece of feedback that I often give on student essays on the media question in this course is that it's not necessarily enough to describe, for instance, a really sexist narrative in the media and say that that is the kind of reason for sexism in society. It's necessary to find some kind of connection. For instance, a piece of research that demonstrates that this same narrative made, for instance, men think that it was acceptable or think that it was normal to behave in this specific way. So what I'm saying here is that it's necessary to to look at what the media are doing, the types of messages they're sending, and then find evidence of those messages impacting people and shaping their kind of thoughts and behavior and ideas in their everyday lives. So it's necessary to look at both what the media is doing and the real kind of impact of that, the demonstrable impact of that. So anyway, media are technologically developed forms of communication, and so the concept of the media refers to both media industries, so the owners of the media, such as types of media such as Fox News, owners of the media such as like Fairfax, Nine Entertainment Group, and the concept of the media also refers to the specific communication technologies that are transmitting information and entertainment between the senders and receivers across time and space. So these technologies are radio, television, podcasts, internet-based streaming, all of these types of things. So the concept of media is really quite broad. It also encompasses social media, which is not necessarily the same as what we would think of as traditional media. I'm going to talk a bit more about the differences between traditional or legacy and new media in a little bit. But essentially, media is a plural for the term medium. So it's, it refers to institutions and their cultural products that mediate between us and reality, that tell us what's going on in the world, like especially now that we're not able to travel and such. It's very unlikely that we're going to go and personally witness things like maybe Prince Philip's funeral or the COVID crisis in India or these big kind of events that are going on around us. Biden's State of the Union address, all of these kinds of recent media items, very unlikely that we are actually going to go and experience those things ourselves. And so we hear about them and take them in as our own reality about what's going on in the world through our exposure to the media. So the media determines what we should know, what we need to know, what is newsworthy, and how it should be presented. And so that's what I mean when I'm saying that the media kind of mediates between us and reality. It's not necessarily inherently anything nefarious. I'm not saying that the media is trying to warp our reality or anything like that. I may say something that sounds a little bit like that later in the lecture, but this is really just a description of how the media work. They bring us information that we are not able to necessarily witness ourselves. But as sociologists, we know that this information is not a neutral entity. It's not valueless. Any decisions that you make about, what is newsworthy, what is not newsworthy, how do I present this story? Do I call this person, you know, are they salvaging things or are they looting them? In the case of some kind of like post-disaster situation, how do I frame this person's behavior? There are always values and always perspectives, norms, ideas coming through there. Like obviously, the people that are doing media reporting are, humans that bring their own cultural perspectives and ideas to their job, and so we always have, it's impossible to have a completely neutral media. There's always a process of mediation going on. And in some cases, the media is so pervasive that we might have trouble distinguishing between, what we know through direct experience and what we've heard about through the media. So things that we, uncritically accept as being true and have, things that we say, yes, that has 100% definitely happened, are often things that we hear about through the media. And so, we know that the media do have like certain standards and codes of conduct that they abide by. They have to meet standards of kind of truthfulness and all of those types of things. But we also do know that they sometimes get it wrong. So um, unless we engage with the media critically, we are at risk of failing to consider how the media is influencing, how we relate to information, or how the media is influencing what we think of as being important and necessary for us to know, and what is not so much. And so this is really where the sociology of the media comes in. The sociology of the media I think, is interesting and important because it helps us to relate critically to the media. It helps us to ask critical questions about what is and is not newsworthy, and why stories are presented in a certain way, how they could be presented differently, how the way that they're presented influences our feelings about them, why that might be the case, whose interests certain narratives serve and whose they do not. And so I think an interesting question to ask as we carry along with this lecture is whether the media reflect reality or whether they shape reality. And this is, of course, a bit of a chicken and egg type of question, because really we don't know if the media is simply responding to the socialization and social norms of those that work for the media, who are not exempt from being part of society and living through all that entails. And so I think this is something to keep in mind. Is the media reflecting the reality we see around us, or is the media actively shaping our reality? Is it introducing new ideas or putting forward certain narratives that we then take for granted? And there's obviously no easy or simple answer to this question, but nonetheless, I think it can help us to kind of think through the role of the media and our role in critiquing and unpacking the media a bit. And so if we're looking at why sociologists study the media, beyond the fact that it is a key site of, the first point there, it's really a key site of social production. It's, it's a site at which our, many of our daily experiences are kind of curated. It's a site for entertainment, information, often at the same time. It's something that that all of us engage with quite a lot, whether we mean to or not. It's very, very difficult to escape the media entirely. The media are also an incredibly significant employer. So there's a lot of people working in the media. If we're taking an organizational perspective, they are a significant industry. And as well, we can remember the role that the media play in socialization. The media kind of mediate our consumption of many aspects of culture, and the media has an incredibly important role in kind of teaching us through socialization. They have a role in imparting knowledge, customs, and normative values. The narratives we see in the media around how certain crimes are portrayed, for instance, are they're incredibly powerful. And the media are also, in many ways, important sites of creativity, cultural expression, artistic endeavor. So it's not necessarily that the media are simply a Machiavellian force that is trying to shape our social norms and expectations. The media is multifaceted. It's something that we all experience. It's something that people work in. It's an aspect of socialization, and it's also a site of creativity and artistic creation. So I think that's important to keep in mind as well. The media is complex, and saying the media is one single thing is disingenuous. So the media has kind of developed from a long and interesting history, and this maps onto the history of technological development. I won't dwell on this too much because I don't think it's centrally relevant to exactly what we're talking about today, but I think nonetheless it's important to consider that the media didn't just kind of spring into being in the early 1700s when we have daily newspapers coming about. That's actually a relatively late step in a long line of the different forms of kind of cultural production, different ways of communicating, different ways of telling stories and sharing information. So I've got a great image here. This is Gutenberg's press, a printing press, which is an incredible development in the process of us being able to share information quickly and not have to handwrite books, which I could not imagine doing. So I think that's a lovely etching. And so flashing forward to the media today, obviously we've moved on quite a bit from Gutenberg and the printing press and early daily circulation newspapers. The media are very multifaceted in many ways. So we have several distinctions that we can make that allow us to define contemporary media through what it is and what it is not. So first are the distinction between mass media and niche media. So mass media are generally, it's what it sounds like, media that communicate to the masses. So this is the kind of general news, the channels that we have. So like Channel 9 is a kind of form of mass media. The high circulation syndicated newspapers that we have, again, mass media. And then in contrast to that, we have niche media. So this is media that naturally has a much smaller circulation. It might be a monthly newsletter or a monthly magazine that's subscription based for motorbike enthusiasts or for people that really like fish or fishing or I'm sure any topic I can think of, there's some kind of form of niche media that caters to it. If you're subscribed to anything that relates to a subcultural interest or anything that has a small circulation and is not necessarily going to be of mass interest and has a kind of target audience of this particular group who are interested in this thing or share this common experience, then that's an example of niche media. So we can distinguish different types of media based on their scale, whether they're kind of macro in scale and scope, whether they're targeted towards a kind of mass audience and thus need to have mass appeal and not write incredibly long stories about fishing, because some people would be really keen on that, but most probably wouldn't care very much. And then the next distinction, old media versus new media. So old media are exactly what we were just talking about: books, newspapers, films, radio, television, things that we would also call traditional media or legacy media. So what we would really traditionally think of as the media. And then new media are things that have come about since the kind of 1990s, early 2000s. So things like things that are mediated through internet, mobile phones, digital technology, computer software. So the the big examples of this are things like social media, but we can also think about YouTube as a really interesting site for alternative forms of media, alternative news sources. YouTube has many content creators that are essentially kind of niche media creators that are creating reviews of video games. I think that's probably not quite so niche. I think that one would probably have quite a lot of appeal. But even more niche things like reviewing like the lowest rated restaurants in a given city, or basically if you can think of a kind of niche audience, there's generally some kind of YouTube channel catering to it. So I think that's a fascinating example. Yeah, so I think the big exemplar of new media is social media, and that's that's a side at which a lot of legacy media is shared, but also information is spread in a new way. And so the kind of bringing together of legacy media and new media is referred to as media convergence. So this is when old media and new media come together. An example of this would be the amount of news that's shared on Facebook when Facebook is not banning it. The amount of news media that's shared on something like Twitter. The fact that most of the kind of commercial channels these days, as well as things like ABC and SBS, have YouTube channels and put their shows on there as well to try and get that young audience engaging with their content. And we can also think about examples such as camera phones. So this is bringing together older technologies along with kind of these newer smartphone technologies, which are, by the way, apparently putting the kind of mid-range, non-expert photographer kind of camera business completely out of business because our camera phones are so good these days. Internet radio is another example of that. And many, I think streaming services are a fantastic example. They are they're bringing traditional forms of film and television into to us in a new way. Essentially, many of these streaming services, they have a catalogue full of older films and TV shows that predated the streaming era. So we can see that it's not necessarily that there's legacy, traditional old media, and then new media. There's also a kind of a crossing of those paths. And so thinking back to our discussion of David Harvey and the kind of time-space shrinking or time-space collapse, I think we spoke about that in the week on globalization. So if you cast your mind back to that, we can see that that the media kind of is also also very much embroiled in this process of time-space compression that David Harvey spoke about. So if you remember, David Harvey spoke about new technologies and their ability to collapse or compress both time and space. So they can compress time because we can now communicate instantaneously, and they compress space because we can travel across space more quickly than we ever could in the past. And if we think about something like Twitter, I've got some is kind of old Donald Trump quotes there. Should update those to some of the more kind of zany ones from from last year. If you look at that, look at those types of examples and think of any of you can think of your personal favorite Trump quote from the previous 4 years, then you can see that the ability of Trump, the kind of use of Twitter before he was banned, allowed him to put out information that was instantly accessible immediately and accessible to anyone across the world. So this is a fantastic example of time-space compression, and the media's power to transcend time and space. So rather than needing to communicate in a more traditional way, needing to talk to journalists and then have them write a story and then have that kind of shipped around the world in hard copy, new media is allowing us to communicate in a kind of faster and faster way. But this process of time-space compression and this kind of shrinking of time and space, reduction of time and space, isn't without consequences. So the instant news, the kind of constant news cycle, can lead to what we can call fake news or false news. It can lead to misinformation. There's the instantaneity of things like Twitter mean that we don't really have the same process of fact checking. And obviously Twitter has tried to address this, which is really interesting. They've introduced a flag that they can put on tweets to say this tweet may not be based on reliable information. Try reading this newspaper article, which is fantastic, but it also takes a little bit of time. So quite often, when a tweet is put out and starts trending, then people have seen it already, and they're probably not going to go back and look at it to verify whether it's been flagged as potentially misleading. So arguably the damage is already done just because it's such a fast platform. So if we're thinking about the kind of power of the media and what the media is able to do, we come back to that question about whether the media is reflecting or shaping our reality, whether it's representing and kind of perpetuating our social norms, or whether it's shaping our social relations. And I'm kind of arguing here that the modern media, they kind of make and perpetuate, but also adjust and remake our social worlds and social relations. So they're sending us these kind of images and responding to the kind of stories that they're putting out there and such. And so, essentially there's, a constant process of reinforcing and kind of reflecting our norms in order to be able to have mass appeal and resonate with a mass kind of platform. But then because they're constantly reporting on new information and such, there's also an element of them kind of shifting and remaking and telling new stories and suggesting new things. So essentially, we can see the power of the media in part through its ability, especially the kind of diffuse media. If we think about the media as being, both kind of official news media and kind of less official, sources of information on the internet, we can see there's websites and social media platforms devoted to things like alien encounters and abductions, and all of these kind of slightly zany things, lizard people, mold organisms that invade people and take over their lives. I'm pretty sure that was a plot of a film, but there's a website out there that's claiming that it's true. And so we can see that millions of people believe these things. Somehow they somehow seem to meet the criteria of newsworthiness. We can see this through looking at the followers of someone like Pete Evans. Somehow there's been a kind of capture of some amount of audience. So, if we try to bring some of the sociological theories that we've used so far in this course to understanding the media, we can start off with functionalism. So, in the 20th century, functionalist theories emphasize that the media fulfill a socializing role, as we've discussed a bit so far. So, they helped people to learn about how to behave in society and therefore kind of aided social cohesion, aided the kind of consensus function of society, helped us all to kind of essentially like live together. And in this sense, according to this kind of view or perspective, um, the media is kind of positioned as watchdogs in a way, as protecting the interests of citizens, trying to maintain a consensus on values and trying to preserve social order. This particular view of the media is related to the sociological concept of the public sphere, this mass forum for debate and the creation of an informed citizenry who are all somewhat on the same page and are able to come together and have enough in common, enough of a consensus to kind of function as a society and be on the same page to some degree. So, arguably, functionalists in the 20th century kind of viewed the media as having somewhat of an integrative function towards social cohesion. And the conflict theory of the media, of course, differs from this quite a lot, especially Marxist theories of the media essentially argue that media are used by the ruling class to achieve a cultural form of domination and an economic form of exploitation of the working class. So they argue that this happens when government and business and any kind of organizations controlling the media use the media to kind of convince the masses that they live in the best possible world that there is available to them, that there is no alternative, that things are as they should be. They use the media to essentially put forward narratives about something like the American dream would be an example. The notion that if you put your nose to the grindstone and work hard, you'll have everything that you've dreamed of. When we know that the American dream of upward social mobility is very unlikely and is becoming an increasingly unlikely prospect for working class Americans in contemporary times. So, like, arguably, that is, something of a false narrative. So, in a Marxist view of the media generally aid in the oppression of the working class, and the media tries to avoid social analysis and tries to avoid criticism and is instead is trying to distract people and keep them occupied. So trying to work as the kind of opiate of the masses, trying to keep them focused on something that is not the kind of unfair conditions that they are working within, their own exploitation. So that's the kind of Marxist view of the media. So I thought that I could talk a bit about what exactly this means or some of the different ways in which this has been interpreted. So ideas about the media as an ideological state apparatus for achieving domination are kind of argued on a number of points by neo-Marxists. So neo-Marxists essentially argue that the media maintain or naturalize the status quo, the kind of way that things are, the way that they always have been, through advocating several ideas. So the first of these is the notion of meritocracy. So the idea that if you just work hard and if you are deserving, if you are good at what you do, then you will achieve what you want to achieve. So the Kardashians are a fantastic example of that. They especially I think the mother's name Kris Jenner. So the mother is always talking about like work and the hustle and like always working. And the Kardashians, even though they're they're famous for arguably like being beautiful and like very very media savvy, social media savvy, they also kind of encourage this idea, this ethos that their beauty is attributable to work. It's not something that comes about naturally. It's something that comes about through, lots of exercise, lots of time and effort, lots of like cosmetic surgery, which they're more open about than many other celebrities, for better or for worse. And so they have this kind of notion that beauty is work, that their success is a product of all of the work that they've put in. So in quite an interesting way, keeping up with the Kardashians as a artifact of media is putting forward a really kind of interesting narrative of meritocracy. It's questionable how genuine that is. There's also the advocating for possessive individualism, so trying to put the self first, championing like individualism through consumerism. There's also a general kind of championing of consumerism itself. So, consumption as a way of forming identity. All of these ideas that go back to the week in which we focused on consumption in this course. The kind of naturalization of the status quo is also kind of advocated for by the way that the media can kind of position specific groups of people. So the media is often quite racist. The classic example of this is if we look at who are typically the bad guys in Hollywood movies. There are some, I don't remember his name, but there's a Mexican American actor whose entire career has been playing the bad guy in films. And I would argue that is, he's being kind of typecast as a very racialized image of like the Hollywood bad guy. There's also a kind of stigmatization of working class and other marginal groups of people. So you can think about like what kind of accents you hear on television. You can think about all of the shows that we have that essentially kind of make fun of working class people. So Kath and Kim is quite a good example of this. Their very put on accents are arguably kind of making fun of Australian, general, more kind of working class accents and sensibilities and such. They would be people with very low cultural capital, and that is basically the joke, that they have really bad taste. And then finally, sexism. So, how men and women are stereotyped and portrayed, and how they're often treated quite differently in the media. So, I thought we could focus a bit on gender in the media, just because I know this is, an area of interest, relates to one of the essay questions. So the media sends a number of kind of messages, or has a number of ways of reinforcing gender stereotypes. So some of the kind of typical messages are that you should look a certain way, that housework or childcare are female activities, that it's generally a mother or a wife undertaking these activities, that that women are sexualized or objectified, and that this is something that's natural and to be expected. And finally, that men are either strong and brave, or that they're kind of stupid. So the notion of the stupid dad, which kind of comes up quite a lot in advertising, is kind of like, at first glance it might seem like a negative portrayal of men, and like, yes, in some ways it is. It's not nice to be a completely clueless stupid dad, but the stupid dad assumes a a kind of competent mum, a mum that's able to pick up the slack. And it's kind of a Simpsons-esque dynamic where you have the Homer Simpson character who's hopeless, and then Marge Simpson is comparatively very competent because she needs to be. If you have a husband who is completely hopeless, then if someone needs to make sure that the kids are like fed and clean and getting to school. So that becomes tacitly assumed to be the kind of feminized responsibility. Yeah, and so one of the kind of examples for thinking about gender in the media is the Bechdel test. So I'm not going to dwell on this too much because it's something that you can take a look at. I'll include a YouTube link for a video that explains this much better than I do, but it's essentially a test for whether there's kind of genuine representation of women that is not completely male-centric in movies. And it's quite a rough heuristic. Essentially, it's a test that questions whether in a film there is at least one scene in which two or more female characters who are named within the script and have a name have a back and forth dialogue about something that is not a man. And this is fine, even if it's something that's stereotypically feminine, like shopping or shoes or about the weather. It doesn't really matter. They don't have to be talking about the UN or anything particularly high-minded. It just needs to be that they are not talking about a man. And so after testing a large number of films, it was found that only about half of them passed the test, and arguably this is a really, really, really low bar. So that's quite concerning in a way if we think about the kind of messages that sends about women and their internal life and their existence in a way that's not completely defined by their relationship with men. And so I think it's important to make the point that failing the test doesn't necessarily mean that a movie is inherently really sexist or terrible. This test is essentially developed just to get people thinking about gender and give us a way to start a conversation about how women are portrayed in films and what that might tell us about how female characters are written. So I've got a couple of links here that you might be interested in taking a look at, and I'll also post a video on this just to kind of give, if you'd like to hear a bit more about this. So essentially the media, like if we think more about gender in the media, the role of gender in the media can kind of validate gendered behaviors, languages, values, and they often do this by kind of representing their ideas about gender or the ideas that they're representing as being something that's normal, that's universal. So the kind of repeated demonstration of certain ideas about gender as something that is like normal, funny, kind of unquestioned can suggest to us this is the way that society is. And again, we can come back to our question about whether is this a reflection of society or is this reshaping society into a more kind of gender essentialist form? I think that's an open topic for debate. Yeah, but essentially the the ideas about gender are it's not necessarily that the media has just decided to hate women or anything like that. There's quite complex reasons why we have such kind of gendered messages in a lot of media. And for an example of this, shaming has proven to be a really, really successful advertising technique. So by telling women in some way or another that they are flawed, that they are kind of in need of something, that there's some kind of issue, advertisers can, essentially try to create a demand or a sense of need for their product, for women to, be liked by men, to feel socially acceptable, to feel, like they are kind of like okay. So, this is an advertising technique that can successfully sell products. So obviously there's quite a strong motivation to engage in that. And there's other examples of why exactly the media engages in very kind of gendered ideas. So I've got some examples of these kind of gendered forms of advertisement, using ideas about gender, using kind of humor that's arguably really insulting to women, using very strong stereotypes of women and their roles in society, and therefore also stereotypes of men as being kind of fed up or annoyed by their wives or of infantilizing their female partners. So, the final thing I want to touch upon in this section is the production of news media. So we've talked so far about the media as this kind of amorphous but also kind of homogenous thing. And funnily enough, there's a little bit of truth to this, but I think it is necessary. Whenever we're using a Marxist perspective, we talk about the owners of the means of production. So I think it's necessary to think about who owns the main sources of news media in our particular society. So the the kind of owners of news media in Australia are predominantly Murdoch, which is News Corp, and the Nine Entertainment Group. They absolutely dominate the Australian media landscape. Australia has a very, very strong concentration of media ownership. We almost have something of a monopoly. This is what Kevin Rudd is very concerned about at present. If that's a story that you're following or something you're interested in, that's definitely something that is very, very central to what I'm talking about here. There's very little competition in the Australian media landscape, and that can be a problem in of itself because there's arguably a lack of diversity of voices and perspectives. There can be a very kind of homogenous approach to certain topics and stories, which can be quite problematic if you think about the media as mediating our reality. So there's some exceptions. The ABC and SBS are state-owned, so they're public media services. They're not owned by these big media groups. And interestingly, recently, the kind of public service media that we've had has done quite well in correcting fake news and has done quite well in providing really timely information and emergency service information to communities, such as during the recent bushfires over the 2019-2020 summer. So possibly there's something to having at least some state-owned media, even though we probably don't want entirely state-owned media because that is also a really big problem. I think the answer here is probably to think about having a more diverse media landscape, but that's really just my opinion. So I've brought up here the kind of most recent map of media ownership and interests in Australia. This is updated by on this website that I've linked here regularly, about twice a year. So you can see here, who owns and who controls all of these different media groups, and you can see it's an incredibly incestuous bunch. The big groups are very, very interconnected. You can see a huge chunk of this is Nine or kind of Murdoch News Corp group. They are connected to or own a really, really large proportion of the news media that we are consuming. So some of the other groups are a bit smaller as well. I think especially when it comes to print media, the kind of Nine and News Corp ownership is very, very dominant. There's very little print media that isn't owned by those groups. So again, when we're thinking about you know, the media as setting specific narratives and who gets to control the narrative, then we do need to think about who owns these groups, even though there are, you know, newspapers and such have their own kind of statutes of independence. It is difficult to see how, you know, how much they are actually upheld in, you know, in any instance in which there would be kind of conflict with the interests of their owning group. So, these are just some kind of summary points, but yeah, in general, mass media are popular because they kind of meet people where they're at. They meet people at the everyday level, and they offer ideas that people often identify with. But it's important to keep in mind that mass media are also a business. They're, you know, informed by a profit motive. They're trying to sell more. They're trying to, you know, as well as informing people and, you know, being engaged in some kind of public service in a sense, they are also trying to, you know, operate as a business. But the media landscape is changing in many ways. There's been a lot of disruptions and changes to mass media in the last 10 years, the huge one being the rise of new media, especially social media. So that's quite an interesting force. And we can see at the moment the you know, the biggest debates and issues around the media and news and such on Facebook is, I think it's reflecting the kind of growing pains of media convergence, of old media and new media trying to coexist and, you know, come together and interact. And it's not always particularly smooth sailing. So I'm going to finish up this part here, and then in the next section of this lecture, I'm going to talk to you a bit about media effects. So some of the theories of the media that you might find helpful for your essay. So I'll leave this here for now.